Harlem in the early 1940s was a place where music carried more than melody. It carried dignity. Every evening the neighborhood seemed to glow with life, as if the streetlights themselves understood they were illuminating something extraordinary. Jazz drifted from club doors, laughter floated through open windows, and the sidewalks filled with people dressed in their finest coats and polished shoes. Harlem was more than a neighborhood. It was a declaration that brilliance could not be erased, no matter how often the world tried to dim it. Inside the famous Cotton Club Annex on Lenox Avenue, the room pulsed with anticipation. Glasses clinked softly, waiters moved quickly between tables, and the stage lights warmed the polished surface of a grand piano waiting patiently in the center of the stage. Everyone in the room knew the same truth. When Duke Ellington sat down at that piano, the entire room would change. Ellington had already become a symbol far beyond Harlem. His orchestra traveled across the country, filling theaters and ballrooms with a sound that seemed both elegant and powerful. But Harlem claimed him in a deeper way. To Harlem, Duke Ellington wasn't simply a musician. He was proof that grace and brilliance could rise even in a world that often tried to deny both. That night the audience waited with quiet excitement. Couples leaned toward one another in whispered conversation, while older patrons sat back with knowing smiles. They had heard Ellington before, but every performance felt like something new, something that could only happen once. Near the back of the room sat a man who watched everything with the calm patience of someone used to observing before speaking. Bumpy Johnson rarely made dramatic entrances. He preferred to arrive quietly, the way a thoughtful reader enters a library respectfully, attentively, and aware that every room holds its own story. Bumpy's presence in Harlem was well known, but it was not built on noise or intimidation. People respected him because he carried himself with composure, intelligence, and a clear understanding of the lines that should never be crossed. Harlem trusted him in a way that few others could claim. As the lights dimmed slightly, Duke Ellington walked onto the stage. The applause rose instantly, warm and sincere. Ellington acknowledged the crowd with a gentle nod before sitting down at the piano. When his fingers touched the keys, the room transformed. The music flowed like a quiet conversation between old friends. Notes rose and fell with elegance, weaving together piano, brass, and rhythm into something that seemed to breathe. Even the waiters slowed their steps, unwilling to interrupt the moment. But while the music filled the room with beauty, something else was happening outside. A black sedan rolled slowly down Lenox Avenue and stopped near the club entrance. The engine idled quietly while several men stepped out, their coats dark against the streetlights. Among them was a man whose reputation traveled ahead of him like a storm cloud, Dutch Schultz. Schultz had built his name through fear and unpredictable power. He believed respect could be forced, bought, or taken never earned. In many neighborhoods, that belief had worked well enough for him. But Harlem was different. Still, Schultz had arrived with a purpose that had nothing to do with music. He pushed through the club doors with the casual arrogance of someone used to being obeyed. Conversations softened as people noticed him. No one caused a scene. Harlem had learned long ago that dignity sometimes meant choosing silence rather than chaos. Schultz and his men moved toward a table near the stage. He sat down heavily, glancing around the room with a smirk that seemed permanently attached to his face. On stage, Ellington continued playing, unaware that the atmosphere below him had shifted. Schultz listened for only a moment before leaning toward one of his men. "That's him?" he muttered. "Yes," the man replied quietly. Schultz studied Ellington with mild amusement. "People say he's a genius," Schultz said. The man shrugged carefully. "That's what they say." Schultz leaned back in his chair. "Let's see if Harlem's genius knows who's really in charge." The words were quiet, but the intention behind them was unmistakable. Across the room, Bumpy Johnson noticed the change almost immediately. He had seen that look before. The Look of someone who believed respect could be demanded like payment. Bumpy's expression remained calm, but his attention sharpened. The music ended to warm applause, and Ellington stood briefly before preparing for the next piece. Schultz stood up. His chair scraped loudly against the floor. The room fell silent. Schultz walked toward the stage with slow confidence. Several patrons lowered their eyes, not out of fear alone, but because they understood how fragile dignity could become when arrogance entered a room. Ellington looked up from the piano as Schultz approached. For a moment the two men simply regarded one another. Ellington's face remained calm, polite, and curious. Schultz smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "So you're the famous Duke Ellington," he said loudly enough for nearby tables to hear. Ellington nodded gently. "I try my best to make music people enjoy." Schultz chuckled. "Music, huh? That's what this is?" Ellington's expression did not change. "It's what I know how to do." Schultz glanced around the room as if expecting laughter. Instead, he found quiet eyes watching carefully. The silence irritated him. "Well," Schultz said slowly, "I've heard Harlem thinks you're something special." Ellington folded his hands calmly over the piano keys. "Harlem has always been generous with encouragement." Schultz leaned closer to the piano. "Let me ask you something," he said. "You play requests?" The question hung in the air. Ellington smiled politely. "If I know the piece." Schultz reached into his pocket and pulled out a small coin. He spun it across the piano lid. The metal clink echoed in the quiet room. "There's your payment," Schultz said. "Play something worth it." The gesture was meant to reduce the moment to something cheap, something humiliating. The coin sat on the polished piano like a small insult shining beneath the stage lights. Several patrons looked away. Ellington stared at the coin for a moment, then slowly lifted it between his fingers. His voice remained calm when he spoke. "Sir," he said gently, "music is not something measured by coins." Schultz's smile faded slightly. "You refusing a request?" he asked. Ellington set the coin back on the piano. "I'm saying that music deserves respect." For a moment the tension felt almost physical. Schultz's men shifted in their seats. The room held its breath. Schultz leaned forward, his voice lowering. "Let me explain something," he said quietly. "In places like this, respect usually comes from people like me." The words were meant as a warning. But before Ellington could respond, another voice entered the moment. Calm, even, unhurried. "Sometimes," the voice said, "respect comes from people who know how to give it first." Every head in the room turned. Bumpy Johnson had stood up from his table. He walked slowly toward the stage, his step steady, his expression thoughtful. There was no anger in his face, only quiet certainty. Schultz watched him approach with curiosity. "And who might you be?" Schultz asked. Bumpy stopped beside the piano. He glanced briefly at Ellington, offering a respectful nod before turning back to Schultz. "My name's Bumpy Johnson," he said calmly. A murmur moved through the room. Schultz studied him for a moment. "I've heard of you," Schultz said. Bumpy's expression remained unchanged. "I imagine you have." The two men stood facing one another, the coin still resting between them on the piano lid. Bumpy picked it up slowly. He examined it for a moment, turning it gently between his fingers. Then he placed it back into Schultz's hand. "In Harlem," Bumpy said quietly, "we don't measure greatness with pocket change." The room fell into complete silence. Ellington watched the moment unfold with thoughtful calm. Schultz stared at the coin in his palm. For the first time that evening, uncertainty flickered across his face. And somewhere beneath the quiet tension of the room, Harlem itself seemed to be listening. The night had only just begun. The silence that followed Bumpy Johnson's words did not feel empty. It felt heavy, like the pause before thunder when the sky gathers its strength. The coin resting in Dutch Schultz's palm seemed smaller now, almost insignificant. Yet everyone in the room understood that the moment had grown far larger than a single insult. No one spoke. The club that had been filled with laughter only minutes earlier now felt like a theater where every person had suddenly become part of the same story. The band members stood quietly near their instruments. The waiters froze mid-step. Even the low hum of conversation from nearby tables had vanished completely. Schultz looked down at the coin again, then slowly closed his fingers around it. He was not used to this kind of resistance. In other neighborhoods, people lowered their eyes when he spoke. In other rooms, the sound of his voice was enough to end arguments before they began. But Harlem was different. Harlem had watched men like him come and go before. Schultz slid the coin back into his pocket. "Well," he said, slowly, his tone carrying the faint edge of amusement that masked irritation, "that's a very nice speech." His eyes moved from Bumpy Johnson to Duke Ellington and then back again. But speeches don't change how the world works. Bumpy did not move. His posture remained relaxed, one hand resting lightly on the edge of the piano. The calm in his expression was the kind that made impatient men uncomfortable. "Sometimes they do," Bumpy replied quietly. Schultz chuckled. "You think this place belongs to you?" he asked, gesturing vaguely toward the club, the crowd, the stage, the music. Bumpy looked around the room, his gaze passing slowly over the people who had gathered there. The men and women of Harlem sat quietly now, but their presence carried something stronger than noise. "No," Bumpy said gently. "It belongs to everyone who respects it." Schultz's smile tightened. For a moment he seemed unsure whether to laugh or grow angry. He turned slightly toward his men, as if searching for the reaction he expected, but even they appeared uncertain. The tension in the room was beginning to shift. Duke Ellington stood quietly beside the piano, watching the exchange with composed attention. He understood something about power that Schultz did not. True power did not always shout. Sometimes it simply waited until arrogance exposed itself. Schultz leaned against the piano, studying Bumpy with growing interest. "You know," he said slowly, "I've heard stories about you." Bumpy nodded once. "Stories tend to travel." Schultz tilted his head slightly. "They say you're a smart man." Bumpy allowed the smallest hint of a smile. "I try to listen more than I speak." The remark drew a few faint chuckles from the back of the room, though most people remained quiet. Schultz tapped the piano lid with his knuckles. "You see, that's the problem with places like Harlem," he sighed. "Everyone thinks they deserve respect." Bumpy's voice remained steady. "Everyone deserves dignity." Schultz shrugged. "Dignity doesn't run businesses," he said. "Money does." For a moment, Bumpy did not respond. Instead, he glanced toward Duke Ellington. "Mr. Ellington," he said respectfully, "would you mind playing something?" Ellington looked at him thoughtfully. "What would you like to hear?" Bumpy gestured lightly toward the piano. "Something that reminds people why Harlem exists." The room remained silent as Ellington slowly returned to the bench. Schultz watched with mild disbelief. "You think music's going to solve something?" he asked. Bumpy's eyes returned to him calmly. "No," Bumpy said, "but it might help you understand something." Ellington's fingers touched the piano keys. The first notes were soft, almost hesitant, as if the music itself was testing the room. Then the melody began to grow rich, confident, elegant. It filled every corner of the club with the kind of sound that could not be measured or purchased. People closed their eyes. Some leaned forward slightly, as though drawn toward the music. The melody carried the feeling of Harlem itself, the struggles, the pride, the quiet determination of a community that had learned to create beauty even when the world refused to offer it. For a moment, even Schultz seemed unsure what to say. He stood there listening, his expression slowly changing from irritation to something more complicated. Bumpy watched him quietly. Music has a strange way of revealing truth. Ellington's playing grew stronger, the notes weaving together like threads in a tapestry that stretched far beyond the walls of the club. It was not simply a performance anymore, it was a reminder that Harlem's strength did not come from fear. It came from culture, from resilience, from people who refused to let their dignity be traded for silence. When the final note faded, the room remained still. No one rushed to applaud. Instead, the silence lingered as though the music had left something behind that words could not easily replace. Schultz cleared his throat. "Well," he said slowly, "that was impressive." Ellington rose from the piano with his usual quiet. "Grace, thank you." Schultz glanced around the room again. The eyes watching him were no longer nervous. They were calm. That unsettled him more than open hostility ever could. "You know what I think?" Schultz said suddenly. Bumpy waited. "I think Harlem's gotten a little too comfortable." The words hung in the air. Schultz stepped closer to the piano again. "I think people around here have forgotten who makes the rules." Bumpy's expression did not change. "Rules aren't the same thing as respect." Schultz leaned closer, lowering his voice. "You sure about that?" Bumpy met his gaze calmly. "I'm certain." For a moment, it seemed like the room itself leaned forward. Schultz's men shifted uncomfortably. They had expected anger. They had expected shouting, threats, maybe even chaos. Instead, they were witnessing something far stranger. Two men speaking quietly. Yet every word seemed to carry the weight of an entire neighborhood. Schultz suddenly laughed. "You know what?" he said loudly. "Maybe Harlem does deserve a little entertainment tonight." He gestured toward Ellington. "How about one more performance?" Ellington looked at Bumpy. Bumpy gave the smallest nod. Ellington sat down again. This time the melody began with confidence. It was stronger, brighter, almost defiant. The piano filled the room with rhythm that felt alive, supported by the quiet tapping of shoes and fingers against tabletops as the audience slowly joined the moment. The atmosphere changed. The fear that Schultz had hoped to create never fully appeared. Instead, the club felt unified. Alive, Schultz watched the crowd with growing irritation. This was not the reaction he expected. He had tried to control the moment, but somehow the moment had slipped away from him. Bumpy leaned slightly toward him. "You hear that?" Bumpy asked quietly. Schultz frowned. "Hear what?" "The sound of a room that refuses to bow." Schultz stared at him. For the first time since he entered the club, he seemed unsure how to respond. The music continued. And the longer it played, the more obvious something became. Harlem was not afraid. And the night was moving toward something neither man could yet fully see. The music from Duke Ellington's piano did not simply end when the final note faded. It lingered in the room like a memory refusing to leave. The audience sat quietly for a moment, almost as if everyone understood that clapping too quickly might break something fragile that had formed in the air. Dutch Schultz remained standing. Near the stage, his expression now more complicated than before. The arrogance that had carried him into the club earlier in the evening had begun to shift into something harder to define. Harlem had not reacted the way he expected. The humiliation he had planned had dissolved into something else entirely, respect. And respect was not something Schultz understood easily. Bumpy Johnson remained beside the piano, his posture calm and patient. He had not raised his voice. He had not threatened anyone. Yet the entire room seemed to breathe in rhythm with his presence. Ellington stood up slowly, offering a small nod to the audience before stepping back from the piano. The musicians of his orchestra waited quietly behind him, watching the tension between the two men who now stood at the center of the room. Schultz's fingers tapped lightly against the side of the piano. The small, restless movement betrayed something beneath his calm exterior. "You know," Schultz said finally, his voice carrying across the quiet club, "I've walked into a lot of rooms in my life." No one responded. In most of them, he continued, people knew how things worked. He glanced around at the audience, studying their faces carefully. But tonight, he said slowly, I walk into Harlem and suddenly everyone thinks they've got something to prove. Bumpy's expression remained steady. No one here is trying to prove anything, he replied gently. They're simply living. Schultz chuckled under his breath. Living, he repeated. He leaned forward slightly, placing both hands on the piano, as if claiming it. Let me explain something to you, Mr. Johnson. The name carried a faint edge of challenge. In my world, Schultz continued, when someone interrupts my evening, it usually ends with consequences. The room tightened. Several men near the back shifted in their seats. The musicians exchanged uneasy glances. Even the club owner near. The bar leaned forward slightly, as though bracing for something that might not be easily undone. But Bumpy Johnson did not move. Consequences, Bumpy said quietly, repeating the word as if examining it carefully. Yes, Schultz said. Bumpy nodded slowly. That's an interesting word. Schultz frowned slightly. Why's that? Bumpy folded his hands loosely in front of him. Because consequences don't always arrive the way people expect. The remark hung in the air like a question without an answer. Schultz's smile returned, though it now looked thinner than before. You're a calm man, he said. I try to be. You ever lose that calm? Bumpy thought for a moment. Only when someone forgets how to treat others. Schultz's eyes narrowed slightly. And you think that's what's happening here tonight? Bumpy glanced briefly toward Duke Ellington. I think a man who gives beauty to the world deserves respect. Schultz leaned closer, lowering his voice. And if someone disagrees? Bumpy's answer came without hesitation. Then they're free to learn. The tension deepened. Schultz straightened slowly. He looked at Ellington again, then back at Bumpy, as though weighing something carefully. You know, Schultz said after a moment, people keep talking about Harlem like it's some kind of kingdom. Bumpy did not interrupt. But kingdoms, Schultz continued, usually have kings. The implication in his voice was clear. Bumpy's expression remained unchanged. Harlem had heard men speak that way before. You're misunderstanding something, Bumpy said calmly. Schultz tilted his head. Oh. Harlem doesn't belong to one man, Bumpy said. Then who does it belong to? Bumpy gestured gently toward the crowd. To the people who build it. The words settled into the room like stones dropped into water. Schultz turned slowly, looking at the audience once more. For the first time that evening, he noticed something he had overlooked before. No one looked. Afraid. Curious, watchful, calm, but not afraid. That realization irritated him more than anything else that had happened. Schultz reached into his coat pocket again. The movement immediately drew attention. Several men in the room stiffened. Bumpy watched the gesture carefully, though his expression did not change. Schultz slowly removed something from his pocket and placed it on the piano. The object caught the light. A small straight razor. The polished steel gleamed beneath the stage lamps. A murmur rippled quietly through the room. Schultz rested one finger against the razor's handle. You ever see one of these before? He asked casually. The question carried an unmistakable edge. Bumpy glanced down at the razor briefly. Then he looked back up. I have. Schultz smiled. They're useful tools. Bumpy nodded. They can be. Schultz leaned closer. Depends on who's holding them. The room had grown. So quiet that even the faint crackle of the club's ceiling lights could be heard. Bumpy studied the razor for a moment. Then he did something unexpected. He reached forward calmly and picked it up. The movement startled several people in the room. But Bumpy handled the razor with the same calm care someone might use when lifting a delicate watch. He examined the blade thoughtfully. You're right, Bumpy said quietly. Bumpy turned the razor slowly in his hand. Barbers use them, he continued. Very precise instruments. Bumpy closed the razor carefully and placed it back on the piano. But instead of sliding it back toward Schultz, he left it exactly in the center. Then he looked directly at Schultz. They're meant to remind people to be careful. The words were calm. Not threatening, but unmistakably firm. The room held its breath. Schultz stared at the razor resting between them. Something about the moment had shifted again. He had brought the blade expecting fear. Instead he found calm. The calm unsettled him far more than panic ever could. Bumpy stepped back slightly from the piano. "Mr. Schultz," he said gently, "tonight could still be remembered as a good evening." Schultz looked up slowly. "How's that?" Bumpy gestured toward Ellington. "You walked into Harlem and heard one of the greatest musicians alive." Schultz said nothing. "You saw a room full of people who love their neighborhood." Still nothing. "And you learned something about respect." Schultz's eyes hardened slightly. "Or," Bumpy's voice remained quiet, "or the night becomes something else entirely." The room felt suspended between two possibilities. Schultz glanced around one last time. The audience remained silent, not hostile, not submissive, simply present. The razor still rested on the piano between the two men. Schultz slowly reached forward and picked it up. He closed it carefully and slipped it back into his pocket. Then he looked at Bumpy Johnson for a long moment. Something unreadable passed across his face. The room waited. And in that waiting, the night approached its final turning point. For several long seconds after Dutch Schultz slipped the razor back into his pocket, the room remained perfectly still. No one moved, no one spoke. The tension had stretched so tightly that even the faint sound of glasses settling on tables seemed unusually loud. Harlem had witnessed many confrontations before, but something about this moment felt different. It was not the kind of standoff people usually expected in rooms where powerful men crossed paths. There were no raised voices, no sudden movements, no chaos. Instead there was silence, and inside that silence something deeper was unfolding. Bumpy Johnson stood calmly beside the piano, his hands resting loosely in front of him, his posture relaxed in a way that only truly confident people ever achieve. He was not trying to dominate the room. He was not trying to humiliate Dutch Schultz, the way Schultz had attempted to humiliate Duke Ellington earlier in the evening. Bumpy understood something that many men in positions of power never learned. Dignity could not be forced, but it could be revealed. Schultz studied Bumpy for a long moment. Earlier that night he had walked into the club expecting to control the entire room with a few careless gestures. Now he found himself standing in front of a man who had not threatened him, had not raised a hand, and yet had somehow taken command of the moment. Dutch Schultz finally exhaled slowly. "Well," he said quietly, his voice far calmer than before, "you certainly know how to make a point." The remark carried a faint trace of humor, but it was not the mocking humor he had used earlier. It was something closer to reluctant respect. Bumpy nodded slightly. "Sometimes the room makes the point for you." Schultz glanced around again. The people of Harlem still sat quietly at their tables, watching the scene unfold. But the fear Schultz had expected to see in their faces simply was not there. Instead there was calm attentiveness, the kind of quiet confidence that comes from belonging to a place that knows its own worth. Duke Ellington remained near the piano bench, his hands resting lightly at his sides. The elegance in his posture had never wavered, even during the most tense moments of the evening. For Ellington, dignity was not a performance. It was simply part of who he was. Schultz looked back at him. "You play good music." Schultz said that the comment sounded almost awkward, as though he was not used to offering compliments. Ellington responded with his usual composed politeness. "I appreciate that." Schultz hesitated, then added quietly, "even if the piano upstairs was better." A few soft laughs rippled through the room. The tension loosened slightly, though no one fully relaxed yet. Bumpy watched Schultz carefully. Not with suspicion, but with the calm patience of someone allowing another man the chance to choose the direction of the moment. Schultz placed both hands on the piano lid again, though this time the gesture carried none of the arrogance it had earlier. "You know," he said slowly, "I've been in a lot of places where people claim to have pride." He looked around the room once more. "But this place—" He paused. "Briefly, this place is different." No one interrupted him. Schultz rubbed his chin thoughtfully. "I walked in here thinking Harlem was just another neighborhood." He continued, "But it seems like it's something more than that." Bumpy's voice remained steady. "It's home." A single word carried enormous weight. Schultz nodded slowly, as though finally understanding something he had not considered before. "Home," he repeated. For the first time that evening, the room no longer felt like a battlefield waiting to erupt. Instead, it felt like a lesson reaching its conclusion. Schultz turned toward Ellington again. "You know what?" he said. "I think I'd like to hear another song." Ellington raised an eyebrow slightly. "A request?" he asked. Schultz smiled faintly. "A respectful one this time." The remark drew a few more quiet laughs from the audience. Bumpy stepped aside slightly, giving Ellington space to return to the piano. As the pianist sat down again, the room shifted from tension back toward anticipation. But the mood had changed. The earlier anxiety had been replaced by something warmer, something more unified. Ellington placed his fingers on the keys and paused. Briefly, then he began to play. The melody that flowed from the piano was softer than the earlier pieces, but it carried a deep emotional richness. The notes seemed to speak directly to the room, weaving together pride, patience, and quiet triumph. People listened differently now. Earlier they had been watching a confrontation. Now they were witnessing resolution. Bumpy stood near the edge of the stage, his eyes scanning the room slowly. Harlem had faced many challenges over the years: prejudice, injustice, misunderstanding. But nights like this reminded everyone why the community endured. Because Harlem never surrendered its dignity. Schultz listened carefully to the music. The melody seemed to settle into his thoughts in a way he had not expected. Perhaps for the first time that evening, he was not trying to control the moment. He was simply experiencing it. When the song ended, applause filled the club. It was not the loud, explosive applause of spectacle. It was something deeper. Gratitude. Ellington stood and bowed his head slightly toward the audience. Schultz clapped as well. Then he turned toward Bumpy Johnson. "Well," Schultz said, "I suppose tonight didn't go the way I expected." Bumpy smiled gently. "Sometimes that's the best kind of night." Schultz chuckled softly. "You may be right." He adjusted his coat and glanced toward the door. "I think it's time for me to head out." Bumpy nodded once. "Travel safely." Schultz paused at the door, then turned back toward the room. "You've got something special here," he said quietly. No one replied. They did not need to. Schultz gave a small nod, then walked out of the club with his men. The door closed behind them. For a moment the room remained silent again. Then someone near the back began clapping slowly. Another joined. Soon the entire club was filled with applause, not for confrontation, not for victory over another man, but for something far more important, for dignity. Bumpy Johnson turned slightly toward Duke Ellington. "Thank you for the music," he said. Ellington smiled warmly. "Thank you for the respect." The band members began preparing for the next set as the room gradually returned to its earlier rhythm. Conversations resumed. Laughter returned. Glasses clinked again as waiters moved through the crowd, but everyone in that room knew they had witnessed something rare. Not a fight, not a spectacle, but a quiet moment when dignity refused to bow. And long after the music faded into the Harlem night, people would still remember the evening when a mobster tried to humiliate a legend and discovered that Harlem protected its own with something far stronger than fear. They protected it with respect.